Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso and I'll be talking about another discourse of the Buddha. And this one's from the Udana, chapter 3, sutta number 6, the Pilindavacchasutta. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the sutta and give some explanations, and then I'll take questions at the end, so feel free to type in questions at any time. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So as mentioned, we'll be looking at Udana 3.6, the Pilindavacchasutta. This is a discourse involving a monk named Pilindavaccha. So the discourse begins, and I'm reading here from Bhante Suddhāso's translation, but I might make some comments on the translation as we go along. So it starts off. Thus have I heard. At one time the Buddha was staying near Rajagaha in the bamboo grove, the squirrels feeding ground. Now at that time, Venerable Pilindavaccha addressed the other monks as lowlifes. So not very polite. Then several monks went to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side, and said to him, Bhante, Venerable Pilindavaccha addresses the monks as lowlifes. So the Buddha addressed one of the monks and said, Please, monk, in my name, tell the monk Pilindavaccha that the teacher summons him. Yes, Bhante, that monk replied. He went to Pilindavaccha and said to him, Venerable Pilindavaccha, the teacher summons you. Yes, Bhante, Pilindavaccha replied. And he went to the Buddha, bowed, and sat down to one side. And the Buddha said to him, Vaccha, is it really true that you addressed the monks as lowlifes? And he replied, Yes, Bhante. So I actually really appreciate his honesty and forthrightness. He's like, well, yes, actually, I did do that. Yeah. This is one of the charming things that we actually find throughout the suttas is there's many places in the suttas where the Buddha hears about somebody's questionable behavior and he has them brought to him, and then he asks them, did you actually do this? And most of the time they're like, oh yeah, I did. Yeah, that was me. So I actually really appreciate the honesty of people. There's also a sutta though where somebody comes to the Buddha and the Buddha does ask a question and the person is evasive and doesn't reply. And then a deva appears and says, if you don't reply, then I'm going to smite you. And the Buddha also says, if you don't give an answer when questioned 3 times by a Tathagata, then your head will explode. So the person did finally actually at the 3rd time answer the Buddha's question. But anyway, that's a different sutta. We're not talking about that one today. I'm glad I'm not the only one who finds these things amusing. I actually have to say, I understand some people think the suttas are like dry and boring. I find them incredibly entertaining, amusing, engaging. The Buddha's actually constantly cracking little jokes, which if you read the suttas in Pali, it's actually especially clear. And the Buddha was constantly making puns and word plays and little jokes. I imagine the Buddha always having this little half smile. You know, that little half smile somebody has when they're making a joke that they know most people aren't going to get. I imagine that being the Buddha. He's always just like, hee. Anyway, so I see the Buddha is always talking in this kind of like lighthearted, relaxed, joyful, friendly way. Even when he's doing things like directly insulting people. Anyway, so coming back to this. So the Buddha asked Vaccha, is it really true that you address the monks as lowlifes? And Vaccha says, yes, Bhante. And the sutta continues. It says, then, having applied his mind to Pilindavaccha's past lives. So in other words, the Buddha used one of his particular psychic abilities. So the Buddha had many psychic powers. And this is something which is important not to skip over. So often, especially these days in convert Buddhist communities, there's a tendency to focus on just on the fact that the Buddha was himself free of greed, hatred, and delusion, and the Buddha taught other people how to be free of greed, hatred, and delusion. And of course, that's very important, and it is the central characteristic of the Buddha. But it's important to recall that the Buddha also had full mastery of the mind, which meant that he also had a full array of psychic powers. He could read people's minds. He could see the effects of karma. He could see how their past karma had created their current conditions. And he could see what future conditions are being created by the karma they're making now. He could also look at somebody's mind and figure out what was necessary to say to them, such that they could see the Dhamma clearly and understand the Dhamma clearly. And he also could look at somebody's mind and trace back their past lives. So based on their current circumstances, he could look back and see their past lives. So that's what he did in this case. He looked at Pilindavaccha and he started looking into Pilindavaccha's past lives. So it's just the same as like if you have a book that's open to page 300, you can just kind of flip back a few pages and be like, oh, this is what it said on page 253. Flip back a few more. This is what it said on page 208. Flip back a few more, page 193, and so on. So in the same way, the Buddha could look at somebody's mind and just kind of turn back the pages and be like, oh, in the past life, they did this. In the life before that, they did this. In the life before that, it was like this. So the Buddha looked at Pilindavaccha's mind and just turned back the pages of a few and looked at the past few lives of Pilindavaccha. And so the Buddha says, having applied his mind to Pilindavaccha's past lives, the Buddha said to the monks, monks, don't complain about the monk Vaccha. He does not address the monks as lowlifes out of hate. For 500 lives without interruption, he was reborn in a Brahmin family. For a long time, he has addressed people as lowlifes. That's why he addresses the monks as lowlifes. So I actually find this incredibly cute. So first off, it's important to understand the Buddha is not necessarily excusing Pilindavaccha's behavior. He's not necessarily saying that it's okay to insult people or to refer to people in denigrating ways. But rather what he's pointing to is that when we develop a habit over the course of many, many lifetimes, then that habit can become really deeply ingrained in the mind. So this particular monk had built up an incredibly strong habit about referring to other people as inferior, as referring to other people as lowlifes is kind of an amusing translation of the word. It's the Pali is vasala. So vasala means, again, somebody of a low caste, low social status. Again, low life, it's more like peasant. Peasant might be a better one. He was always calling the other monks peasants. And the other monks are like, what is this dude doing? He's always calling us peasants. And the Buddha looks at this monk's mind, and he realized, well, this monk has been a member of one of the highest strata of society for hundreds of lifetimes. So he has this incredibly strong habit of referring to everybody else as peasants. So for him, it wasn't a matter of like, I'm now going to insult these other monks by calling them peasants. It was just like, that was how he was used to addressing people. That was how he was used to labeling people. Kind of like if you look at a cat and you're like, oh, it's an animal. Whereas if you said that to another person, they might be a bit insulted. If you were all like, oh, Samanar Nipiko, you're an animal, you would probably be a little bit offended by that. So in the same way, it's this particular monk had built up a habit, and that habit was expressing itself in his speech. Again, though, it's important to recognize that in our practice of developing right speech, we do still need to cultivate an awareness of the effects that our speech is having on other people. So Pilindavaccha, maybe he wasn't speaking out of hostility or aversion, but nonetheless, he was speaking in a manner that was not considerate, because he wasn't considering, how will the other people feel when I'm calling them peasants? Will people be offended by this? Will they be upset by this? Is it actually appropriate? Because the other thing that's important to understand, and this the Buddha says this in many places in the suttas, he says that when somebody enters the monastic sangha, then they no longer have any caste. So whether you're coming from a low caste or a high caste, whether you're coming from low social status or high social status, when you enter the monastic sangha, you now have zero social status, no caste at all. So whether somebody comes from a Brahmin family, in the case of the Buddhas, of the Buddha's time, somebody coming from a Brahmin family or a Khattiya family, so the high castes, or whether they were coming from a Vesa or a Suddha family, so the low castes, or whether they were coming from outside the caste system. Then once they enter into the monastic order, then we're all simply reckoned as monks, bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. There's no longer any sense of being a Vesa or a Suddha or a Khattiya or a Brahmin. All of that falls away. The Buddha, in another sutta, he gives the simile. He says, just as 4 rivers that all flow into the ocean, while the water is in each of those 4 rivers, it's called by 4 different names. But once the water flows together into the ocean, then it's just called the ocean. It loses its prior distinction. You can no longer say, oh, this is Ganges River, and this is that other river, and this is the Indus River, and this is that other river. It all just becomes the waters of the ocean. So he said, in the same way, people come from the 4 different castes, and when they enter the monastic sangha, then their prior designation drops away, and they're simply known as sangha members. And this actually is a really important thing to keep in mind. So when people enter into the monastic sangha, we want to forget what they were prior to becoming a monk. We want to forget their prior social status, their prior social conditioning, whatever they had done before as a lay person. And we want to see them simply as a monk, simply as a member of the monastic community, simply as heirs of the Buddha's life. And so the sutta ends with the Buddha saying a verse. It ends with the poem, the Buddha saying, "In whom dwells no deceit or conceit, one who is rid of greed, unselfish, with no need for hope, with anger eliminated and quenched, they are a Brahmin, a contemplative, a monk." So this last brief verse, it's also pointing to the importance of dropping conceit. The importance of dropping this attitude of thinking like, oh, I am better than other people. In this case, it's someone who was coming from being born in a high social class, a high social status. And not just in this life, but for hundreds of previous lifetimes as well. This person had been always born in a high social class, and thus had cultivated this habit of thinking of himself as better than others, of thinking of others as beneath him. So when one attains awakening, one clearly recognizes that we are not better or worse than others. One clearly recognizes that to think I am better than others or I am worse than others, these are both simply manifestations of self-centeredness, manifestations of self-identity. So one drops those conceits of superiority or inferiority, or even the conceit of equality. One recognizes that any self-concept is ultimately the product of delusion and defilement. So the Buddha says, in one whom dwells no deceit or conceit. So there's no deceit either of oneself or of others. So we're clearly aware of our own nature. So we're not deceiving ourselves about who we are and what we are. And therefore there is no conceit. There's no concept of me. There's no concept of me being this or me being that, of me being better or me being worse. All of that drops away. We recognize that everything simply is what it is. And none of it is me or mine. And therefore any conceit, whether conceit of superiority, inferiority, or equality, any conceit is ultimately delusional. That's ultimately wrong. And the Buddha says one who actually has this, that's the kind of person who can be called the Brahmin. So here there's actually a little subtle jab at Pilindavaccha. So Pilindavaccha is going around thinking like, I am a Brahmin. I am a high-class person, not like these other peasants. Well, the Buddha is saying, well, the real Brahmin is the one who drops all conceit. The person who drops all self-centeredness, who drops all sense of superiority or even any sense of inferiority or equality. One who no longer compares themselves to others. One who no longer thinks in terms of me and mine. That's the kind of person who actually is worthy of being called the Brahmin. So Brahmin here meaning not somebody from a hereditary caste, but rather a holy person, someone who is innately pure. And such a person is worthy of being called a samana. So samana means a contemplative, so one who's seeking peace. And such a person is worthy of being called a bhikkhu, worthy of being called a monk, worthy of being called a religious mendicant. So this is the Pilindavacchasutta, so a short and amusing discourse by the Buddha. So we can respect the discourse with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I see a few people checking in online. So hello to Mano, Maria, Bhumika, Kumu, Yankee, Anthony, Mary, and Janaki. Welcome to all of you. I don't see any questions though. Bhavani says, what is meant by Savaka Sangha? It's a little off topic because that's not directly addressed in this sutta, but I'll give a brief answer. So Savaka means one who listens, and Sangha means community, and usually has the specific meaning of monastic community. So the Savaka Sangha is the community of people who listen to the Buddha. Usually refers specifically to the community of monks that listen to the Buddha, followers of the Buddha. That's briefly speaking what it means. And that seems to be the only question, so we'll go ahead and conclude it this time, and we'll see you for the live stream.